So thank you so much for everyone who's been here so far. And I am delighted to introduce Frank Cetera of the New York Small Business Development Center Onondaga Regional Office at the Onondaga Community College. I think I got all that right because I read it off your slide. And thank you so much for being here to talk about these issues with us today.
Thanks, Danny. Hi, everyone. My name is Frank from Syracuse, New York. So I traveled a little bit to get here today as well, but I'm always happy to drive into the Adirondacks. And I'm going to spend a few extra days here as well after we're finished with our business. So excited about that as well. Our SBDC offices range all across the country. Okay, so even though I haven't typically worked with businesses in the North Country, my colleague Angela from Canton SBDC is here, and she is one of the representatives on the Businesses in Transition Center that you heard about earlier, representing our SBDC offices. But even though I haven't personally worked with many of North Country businesses, I have expertise in the employee ownership sector, which is allowing me to bring that expertise to a wider audience now, particularly in areas that have that access to the SBDC services. What we tend to try to do at the SBDC is create an opening for businesses or entrepreneurs or those interested in startups and development to find their path to that startup, right? Or to find their path to that purchase, or to find their path to that transition. And along the way, to help identify for those businesses or for those startups who are the specialists, who are the other business professionals, business-to-business professionals that they need, and along the line, help them with developing that baseline business plan or cash flow analysis that they might need to make that startup a reality. So for us in the SBDC, employee ownership is actually something fairly new, right? You'll hear from Rob and CDI in just a few minutes here, who have been doing this work, specializing in this work for quite some time. But the SBDC is a broad-based educational organization providing public consulting to small and medium enterprise businesses. And we cover the gamut of any type of business that you can imagine. Okay, I've worked with everything from sole proprietor, stay-at-home mom working on a blog, right, monetizing a blog, all the way up to one of my recent clients is a machinery shop that was just purchased by some of its former employees. It wasn't converted into a cooperative, but it was an employee buyout of that machine shop. And so, covering a wide range of business types, we do try to react, if not be proactive, to the needs of the business community and to the needs of the general economic development community as well. And so the opportunity to engage in employee ownership means that we have to both help educate the public about employee ownership and advocate for it, but also educate ourselves internally as SBDC advisors, okay? And so that's part of the work that's ongoing now as well. So if you go to your local SBDC office, if you're watching online, if you're watching this on YouTube, and you go to your local SBDC office and you say, I want to turn this business into a worker cooperative, and they give you a blank stare, don't be surprised, okay? We're still getting the word out to our colleagues across the state and across the country about employee ownership. The great thing about having this large network is that you can be referred to one of our advisors who has the expertise, okay, in this area or multitudes of other areas as well. So that's a little introduction about how we work in terms of the context of employee ownership right now. And what I'm going to do today is give a brief overview of employee ownership, the idea of worker ownership. You've already heard some great examples today from these case studies. There's really nothing more valuable than hearing it right from the workers themselves, the owners themselves, and hearing about those case studies, getting the actual practical examples. But we do need to step back a little bit and take a broader look at what the structures are and how they can be developed in different formats at the same time. Give people a chance to be introduced to these ideas from a platform of the pros and the cons, the benefits and responsibilities, why or why not you might think about entering into one of these forms of employee ownership. And you've got lots of other great resources out there on the internet, on the web, from other professional development organizations, for other co-op development organizations. The amount of material is astounding right now, and it's being added to every day. Okay, so this little bit of an introduction that you're going to get here hopefully will whet your appetite to go out and find more, right? Talk to more experts in your area or from people within the networks that we are all a part of here, and can, build your sense of understanding on this journey. But the basics, when we talk about employee ownership right now, generally we're talking about two basic forms of that, being the ESOP or the worker-owned cooperative. And the basic differences are often in terms of scale of a business, as well as potentially in the democratic governance potential of the business. And so a couple bullet points up here for the ESOP. Ownership is held in a trust through a tax-qualified retirement plan. So it's a slightly different structure than a worker cooperative, in which you've got one vote, one share. In an ESOP, you've got multiple shares that are potentially held through this trust, and at the same time, you don't necessarily have democratic voting rights as a part of that ownership. However, it's a different manner of how you enter into that employee ownership and the resulting position of the employees once they enter that employee ownership between the ESOP and the worker cooperative. All right. So as we heard earlier today, in the buy-in to become an employee owner of a worker cooperative, that there's that member equity share that somebody purchases into and maintains and builds that equity over time. We see that in the worker-owned cooperative, whereas as an employee stock ownership plan participant, your purchases of those pieces of stock are a benefit to you, and they don't come right out of your pocket. And then there's also various tax incentives that you'll be able to learn more about. I'm not going to go into detail about those right now because that's really not what I want to talk about in terms of the work that we're doing right now with the SBDC and our outreach, and how we can increase the role of communities in engaging and advocating for employee ownership, but also at the same time how we can increase the blooming of the number of employee-owned businesses that we have. It's one of the most important reasons around why employee ownership, right, is not just succession planning in general, right, from an individual standpoint or from an individual business's standpoint, but from a community standpoint at the same time. All right? It's great when you can identify an individual, help them through the process of succession planning, and have that buyout from the employees, and that succeeds in maintaining sustainability of that business, maintaining those jobs, and creating, a long-lasting legacy of that owner as well as that business within that community. All right, but the other benefits are that it reduces the need to recruit new business into a community, right? One of the things that economic development has been highly focused on for many years, right, is recruitment, right? Let's bring new businesses into a community, into a city. Let's, give them great tax benefits. Let's, give them the great advertising campaign of how great this place is so that they'll bring their business here, so that they'll bring their jobs here. What about if we think in the long term, in the big picture, about having to reduce the step of recruiting new businesses and instead just save the businesses that we currently have, right? And reduce that economic inefficiency, okay, we can refer to it as, from a larger scale perspective of your municipality or of your multiple municipality region. So that's one of the ways that it's important to understand why this is important, why this is a consideration that we need to undertake right now, aside from individual business owners and individual businesses, is that from the economic development planning idea of a community, of a city, etc., that you can reduce those inefficiencies and you can increase not only the number of businesses and jobs that you retain, right, but also all the benefits that come along with those from a municipal standpoint. So there are challenges that come along with employee ownership, but of course there's challenges that come along with everything. And one of the things that we do as consultants and as SBDC advisors is to help folks understand what those challenges are. I tell people that I have the shortest elevator pitch speech ever for what we do at the SBDC. It's 2 words. Let's hear it. It's 2 words. Does anybody want to guess?
Don't do it.
Don't do it. That's 3 words. My 2-word elevator pitch is reduce risk. Okay? So what we do is educators, essentially, right? We do some classroom education work, right, to groups, but most of our educational work is one-on-one, right, or one-on-2 or one-on-3, whoever that group of owners happens to be. But our goal is to make sure that you, as a client, as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, have the right information to make the decisions that you need to make, right? To reduce the risk in your decision-making process to ensure the inevitable success that you would like to see. So when you see a list of challenges like this, these are not, we don't post this kind of information to dissuade you from getting into business, to dissuade you from going into a particular type of ownership, but to understand what those steps are, right? Being transparent up front, being aware up front of what you need to do and how you need to overcome, what you need to learn about, what the future steps are that you're going to have to engage in. So cash flow, fiduciary duties, IRS oversight with ESOPs, and ownership culture, participatory management, and effective governance. These are all things that very likely many people do not have an understanding or knowledge of at this point. Because even though we do have, I think, somewhere around 6,000 to 7,000 ESOPs in the United States right now, somewhere around 500-600 worker co-ops in the United States right now, it's not a large number by any stretch of the imagination. And because it's not a large number, it leaves a huge number of people to be educated on and to become knowledgeable in these aspects if they want to enter into this channel themselves. Why now? You've probably seen a slide similar to this, or will see a slide similar to this many times if you continue to learn about employee ownership over time. The silver tsunami, and I want to sort of sidebar for a second and apologize because I was just on a conference call recently where somebody brought up the concern that using the word tsunami can be insensitive to people in the Pacific Asian realm who have gone through very significant environmental social disasters due to tsunamis as an economic disaster, environmental disaster. So it's still on the slide. I'm hoping maybe somebody will decide there's a better term for it that maybe is not as insensitive as some people have considered to be. But the reality in the numbers is still there in regards to the baby boomer generation. We're looking at approximately 24.7 million employees in the private sector, payroll of $949 billion, sales of $5.14 trillion across the United States, retiring baby boomers, over half of the businesses that are privately held. So that's a lot of turnover. That's a lot of transition and succession that needs to take place. And these are figures pulled from Project Equity 2018 report. I'll also let you know that the slides that I'm using today are pulled from a larger slide deck that was developed in collaboration with the Democracy Collaborative, whose logo you see on the bottom right there. I'm really fortunate to be able to have relationships not just within the SBDC, but between other professional service organizations like Democracy Collaborative, like CBI, like the Democracy at Work Institute, like Cooperation Works, all these different folks from around the country, right, who are able to work together to find the answers as well that we might need. And so the SBDCs and the Democracy Collaborative created a working group to be a first step in developing materials for educating SBDC advisors across America once the Main Street Employee Ownership Act was developed, which
Aren't those numbers just proof that retaining rather than
Yes.
recruiting is in everyone's best interest? Right there,
Right.
there it is.
So, what's your name?
Donna.
Donna says, isn't it proof in the numbers right here that retaining versus recruiting, it just makes sense, right? Why would you have to, for any reason, go through reinventing the wheel, essentially, when you've got all these employees, all these jobs, all these businesses already in existence, right? And yeah, absolutely, I agree. And of course, you know, there's the piece of the pie that's the legacy of the business owner too, which, you know, is really like that cherry on the top of the sundae, right? It's like, do you want to see the work that you've done disappear? Do you want to see the work that you've done maybe change significantly from the vision that you had? I mean, most people work their whole lives building a business not to see it just sort of close down at the end, but want it to continue, right? They want it to continue to be an important part of their community and of their neighborhood. So there's so many reasons to keep these businesses and retain them as opposed to reinvent them. And of course, here are some of those other statistics related to why keeping a business local and why keeping your dollars local make a lot of sense economically for any municipality. The local jobs matter, the buy local campaigns that have been in existence for good 10, 15 years now really were a wave of their own during that period of time, but show you that there are economic benefits, right, to keeping the money local in terms of spending it with local businesses. When you shop locally, you've got, where's the number? 57 jobs per 10 million spent versus 14 jobs per 10 million spent. So the idea is that, right, you keep your money local, you keep your jobs maintained local, and you just have a healthier community overall. And so I mentioned the Main Street Employee Ownership Act. That, of course, is one of the big reasons why the SBDC is a part of this opportunity now to assist with employee ownership in the United States. In 2018, in August of 2018, federal legislation was passed. Again, thanks to Senator Gillibrand for her work with that bill. What it does is it requires the SBA to undertake a couple different really important actions to enable an increase in employee ownership development. So the one that most impacts me and my work in our SBDCs is that we now are required to provide training on employee ownership, training and education and advising services. And so even though in the past, if somebody were to come into one of our offices and say, I'm interested in ESOP or a worker cooperative, right? Can you help me? I mean, we would have never turned them down or sent them away, right? We don't do that to any clients who come into our office, but the knowledge base on that would have been very small, and it would have been more challenging for our SBDC advisors to make that step in consulting than it will be in the next 1, 3, 5 years as we spread that experiential knowledge and as we create the resources and tools within our SBDC network to help with that advising. Okay. Also, it means that we're going to be more proactive, okay, with our outreach and advocacy of employee ownership at the same time. So now we're just not waiting for people to come into our door who might be interested in this. We are advocating and promoting it just like we do many of our other programs, such as MWBEs, right? Or procurement practices, you know, all these other specialty areas that we have that we are able to engage the public with, not just in a reactive way, but in a proactive way, we can continue to do with the employee ownership at this point in time. There's also the coordination between the SBDCs and the SBA in regards of sharing data and information back and forth. That's something that we've always done, of course, through our economic impact reporting, but it's something that we'll continue to do and increase by including some additional metrics, I'm sure, in regards to employee ownership. If you're an SBDC advisor out there watching online right now, make sure that you encourage your local and state office to include tags for employee ownership in your client database reporting so that we can easily pull that information at some point in the future. And then the SBA's guaranteed lending programs that are already in existence are also mandated to figure out solutions to that personal guarantee problem and to access to those guarantees through SBA preferred lending institutions at the same time. And we're all really waiting with bated breath to see how that's going to turn out in the end. But we are confident and excited that, you know, that is going to happen in some way, shape, or form, at least as a first step forward. How much time do I have left?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, all right. How does the SBDC advisor provide services in this space? So, as I mentioned earlier, my pitch is that, you know, I'm here to help our clients to reduce risk, all right? Now, the bigger picture, right, is to promote local economic stimulus, and that's essentially the point of the SBDCs as well. If not for the SBDCs, you wouldn't see, for instance, in New York State last year, we accounted with economic impact for over $270 million investment in businesses across the state from our clients, and over 5,100 jobs impacted, either creation of new jobs or retention of jobs. And we do this very efficiently and very effectively, and we have done it so for well over 25 years at this point in time. So we deliver primary program operations strategic plan language from the New York SBDC, deliver innovative, practical, and realistic advisement services responsive to the continuously evolving needs of small businesses. And so we are at a point right now of a large change in the needs of our small businesses related to the baby boomer generation. And how are we going to do that? Well, one of the ways we can do that is through rapid deployment advisement and counseling and enhancing the quality of our outcomes. And to do that, we need to create resources, we need to create educational opportunities and knowledge within our network. We need to create partnerships with other technical service providers who are, in many cases, much more experienced than our SBDC staff is in these components of employee ownership. And in any case, we'll continue to do what we've always done, right, is to screen, funnel, identify pathways for, and work the relationships to the best of our ability to make sure that our clients are getting what they need when they need it. And this includes the funders, right, and the financiers at the same time. There's not a whole lot of folks in the banking community yet that understand how to lend to co-ops. We're fortunate there are some specialty lenders, right, such as the Cooperative Fund and others that do that work. My engagement with our local CDFI credit union in Syracuse offers another pathway for financing of worker cooperatives and employee ownership. But our job is not just to work with our clients and to work with professional service providers, but also to maintain and build relationships with our banking and financial institutions so that they can at the same time understand what the needs are of our clients that are coming in. And so as our clients are developing specialized needs when it comes to employee ownership financing, our job is also to take that need to our financiers, right, and to the banks and the financial institutions that we work with and make sure that they are ready, or at least prepared that this is coming, and that they can, make adjustments as necessary as well to help with our clients' needs. And then I think this is my last slide. I'm going to make it the last slide no matter what, because I know my 5 minutes are probably just about gone. But this just gives you a broader breakdown, too, of how we work directly with our clients and with the workforce, and what we will be doing to prepare for employee ownership over time. As I mentioned earlier, this slide was one of many as a part of this slide deck developed in cooperation with a number of SBDC centers across the country. We worked with some folks in Northern California, with some folks in the state of Washington, with some folks in Buffalo, New York, as well as Syracuse, New York. And additional SBDC centers have come into this working group from Rhode Island and Minnesota, and one other place that I'm failing to recall right now. But as we develop this relationship farther, and as we create more opportunity for SBDC advisors to understand their role in employee ownership, and understand what that track is, right? Where they fit within that relationship with technical assistance providers, with financiers, with community development, economic development. As we continue to develop that, really looking forward to our SBDC services becoming an integral part of employee ownership, and hopefully folks from across the North Country will feel free to contact their local office, and they can, engage with whatever experts they need to facilitate each individual client's needs for employee ownership. So, thank you.
Mike's there from this office.
Is there a charge to be your client?
There is not. That's one of the amazing things about it. We are a tax-funded agency. We get part of our money from the SBA, Small Business Administration. We get part of our money through the SUNY system, State University of New York, and then we get a small portion of our money from fee-for-service workshops that we do as well. But all of our one-on-one advising services are no cost and 100% confidential to the public. So that's why we are a good first-stop shop, right? Many of our advisors have specific experience in specific areas that lend to the expertise of our network, okay? But that's also why we work with so many professional service providers outside of our SBDC network, right? We refer people to the bail team members, right? The bankers, accountants, insurance, legal, and other specialist advisors that they might need along their pathway. When we encounter a hump that we can't help them get over, right? We help them find that information through our research network or through another professional service provider.
One other question, and I think Canton is supposedly our local.
Yep.
She
made it today.
Oh, that's
Angela, do you
really-
want to speak to that a little bit about your
I was
your
just
role?
going to say, Syracuse is also 2.5 hours away. Can you, are you required to go to Canton? Are we here in Hamilton County required to go to Canton?
No, you're not required to go to any specific region. I mean, it's just for your convenience as to who you'd like to use, right? Sometimes people will come to us in Syracuse because of specific programming that we offer, or maybe if they live closer to another center but they work regularly in the Syracuse area and it's more convenient to come maybe for a day meeting, or, like I said, for the specifics of an individual advisor's skill set, right, as well. However, we can also co-counsel, right? So if you were to go to your Canton Center first and get an advisor assigned to you there, a primary advisor, they're allowed to then contact me or others and say, hey, we'd like to work with you on this client's project because it's employee ownership and we know that you've got some expertise in that as well. And so, today's day and age, phone calls, video calls, et cetera, are also really convenient.
Angela, do you want to take just a minute to introduce yourself as our local?
Sure. So, Angela Smith with the SUNY Canton SBDC at Clinton Community College. So, we serve 7 counties. So, basically from the Canadian border all the way to Lake George. Our main office is in Plattsburgh, New York, but we can come and meet people in the region here with advance notice. We're happy to come closer to facilitate meetings. As Frank mentioned, the SBDC is, definitely New York-wide as a group, but also, across the U.S. So if people have different areas of expertise, we team up to make sure we can bring it to you if we don't have the expertise in the office. So happy to have any discussions that you like and identify next steps that you'd like to work on.
Where in Plattsburgh?
We are at Clinton Community College,
Okay.
so on the campus there. That's our main office, but we have satellite offices all over our 7 counties. Usually we'll meet at local chambers of commerce. Sometimes some lenders have conference rooms that we can use. So we usually have friends in the community that will give us some confidential private space for us to meet with clients.
And Christy, they meet at your office too, right?
ABDC is
Sure.
alone?
No, they are in Saranac Lake.
Well, thank you so much, Frank.
You're welcome.
And with no further ado, we're going to introduce Rob Brown from Cooperative. Oop, we missed a couple. There we go. The Cooperative Development Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today. Would you like the lights on or off?
It's up to the audience.
Would love feedback. You were
On or off?
the Main Street, that it's through.
You want the lights on or off?
But, they're like,
Okay.
Yeah, it's fine with me. Is this your phone?
It's just for recording you.
Oh, okay, that's where the voice is coming from. So, let me just make sure I know what I'm doing here.
Rob, what's
Okay.
your last name?
Rob Brown.
Rob Brown?
Yes. Are we good? Okay. So, yeah, let's just start. So my name is Rob Brown. I am a program director with the Cooperative Development Institute. CDI works, some tidbits about CDI. CDI works throughout New England and rural New York. We are the U.S. Department of Agriculture designated Cooperative Business Development Center for the Northeast. So in many respects, we're sort of like an SBDC for cooperatives. Same sorts of practical, pragmatic services, as well as a lot of networking and public education services that we do all throughout New England and into upstate New York. We have about upwards of 25 staff all throughout New England and in Plattsburgh. We have 2 staff. We are a virtual remote organization, so we all live all over the place and do work all over the place. We don't work out of a central office, so that allows us to be all over the place. We are an independent nonprofit. So as opposed to, we get funding from U.S. Department of Agriculture, but we also do a lot of philanthropic fundraising and a lot of fee-for-service work as well. So that's a little bit about CDI. We've been around since 1994. And we do have 3 main program areas: housing cooperatives, particularly with mobile home parks, helping mobile home parks buy out and be resident-owned cooperatives. We do a lot of work in food systems, agriculture, food producers, and then the program that I run, Business Ownership Solutions, which specifically works with existing businesses in conversion transition to employee ownership. It's sort of the very front end. There's not an assumption of that. Sometimes business owners get in touch with me because they're thinking about exiting and they have a broader set of questions, and I'm happy to help with that to the extent that they're interested in pursuing the path of a worker cooperative conversion. We, CDI, provides sort of a full suite of services around that, from doing the design work, financial analysis, business plan. We do informal business valuations, transaction structure and financing. We're not lenders, but we work closely through partner lenders to help do that. And then post-transaction, as Ralph was talking about, we continue to work with clients to do some ongoing training afterwards, training, coaching, mentoring, technical assistance, particularly around development of boards of directors. So these are a few slides here that are a bit duplicative of some stuff that Frank showed, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on here, but here's some stats. Sometimes these statistics are a little different depending on what data people are pulling on and what year, but this is generally. The one thing I would want to point out is that reams of studies of employee-owned companies have shown universally that they are more productive, more profitable, lay off fewer people in the bad times, employ more people in the good times. They generally tend to perform better than similarly situated, conventionally owned firms. And the silver tsunami, I'm going to jump over that. A couple of stats I do like to point out, because Frank didn't touch on these, but it is important to understand that this could be a potential crisis, and I think particularly in rural areas. I live in Maine, and I do a lot of work in Maine, working with some businesses here in New York in rural areas, and I think this challenge is most challenging perhaps in rural areas. If a business that employs 20 people in a city goes under, nobody notices. Those 20 people get jobs, nobody notices. If a business that employs even 5 people in a rural community goes under, it can be a big hit to those individual employees and to the whole community. And that is why, for our purposes, we do tend to focus a lot on rural areas, because the impact can be so much greater in preserving even smaller and more marginal businesses that have a footprint, have a track record. Preserving those businesses is really important to small rural communities. So that pitch aside, these are some interesting stats that people don't know about, but the fact that over half of business closings are due to owner retirement, and that is the largest single source of avoidable job loss in the U.S. And I'll get into the trying to sell a business issue, but a lot of business owners are like, I don't have time to think about this. I'll worry about it when I'm ready to retire. I'll just sell my business when I'm ready to retire. That doesn't work out all that often, and the smaller and more rural the business, the data shows it works out even less often. Liquidation and closure of businesses is by far and away the most common fate of a business in rural communities. And then just generally, the annual rate of retirement is projected to double. It's the baby boomer wave. So again, Frank touched on some of this, so I'm going to skip over this because I have some actual company stories to tell that I think will be interesting for you. But these types of employee ownership transitions, like I said, if you want to do a worker cooperative conversion, we do a ton of services for you before, during, and after a transition. If it's an employee stock ownership plan, we can do some guidance for you, connect you to the appropriate technical assistance advisors, and maybe do some work with the company if they're interested around the ownership culture aspects. And if it's a senior management buyout, which is also an employee ownership transition, an inside buyer, inside to the company, right? Then same kind of thing. We can help. Oftentimes, it's connect them to SBDC so that internal entrepreneur can get some experience with financial literacy or understanding financials or business planning and so forth. So, and we've gone over this. So the only thing I do want to touch on around the ESOPs is the tax advantages are tremendous to ESOP transitions. particularly if you do it, if you thread all the needles, there's tremendous tax advantages that can really make it worth it. The disadvantage, and why we don't tend to talk about them too much in these fora, is that they're really expensive. I should catch myself. They're relatively very expensive. So you have to be a company of a certain size with a certain amount of cash flow in order to afford to put in place the ESOP, in order to avail yourself of all the tax advantages that net make the ESOP advantageous. So just to put an ESOP in place is usually $50,000 to $100,000, and then annually, in perpetuity, you're probably going to spend somewhere between $25,000 and $75,000 on the maintenance of that ESOP. And the idea of the heavy regulatory scrutiny from multiple agencies at multiple levels, state and federal often, and the complexity in the law require a lot of advisors, highly compensated advisors, ongoing. So that's why ESOPs do tend to be expensive, but if you're of a sufficient size, it can be a really good option. I would say at least 80% of the businesses out there are not big enough to even consider an ESOP. So that's why we tend to talk about the worker cooperative model and promote that, because it's employee ownership for the rest of us, right? So this is the definition, just to sort of set some understanding here. This is the definition of a cooperative that I like to use. It's fairly plain English. It's a business that's jointly owned and democratically controlled by its members, and that operates for the benefit of its members. So cooperatives are corporations, but as opposed to being corporations that are associations of capital and investors, they're associations of people who are members. And those members have an equal buy-in and equal share to that cooperative. And there are all sorts of types of cooperatives that have different membership bases and address different needs, but they all adhere to this basic definition. Whether it's a consumer food co-op or a producer co-op like Cabot Creamery, a democratically owned corporation by about 5,000 dairy farmers throughout New England and New York, or a worker cooperative like Railroad Avenue Supply Company, or an independent business cooperative like Ace Hardware. They all adhere to this basic definition. They are democratic corporations owned by members and operating for the benefit of those members. So I'm going to cover a few items. How is it used in succession planning, and tell that through some stories and examples. To answer the question about who's a good candidate, I always get that question, what's a good candidate for a conversion? Some advantages and disadvantages and basic process. So how's it used in transition planning, business planning? There are three main buckets that I tend to define. One is the immediate exit. An immediate exit, it could be the business owner who's like, I'm too busy, I'll sell it when I'm ready to retire, and all of a sudden they can't, and it causes all sorts of personal, marital, and family problems. It could be the death or disability of the primary business owner, manager, runner, and the rest of the family may or may not have some connection to the business or work in the business, but they certainly don't want to take it over as managing owners, right? So in that type of unfortunate situation, an employee ownership transition done quickly could really save a business. So there's different reasons around this immediate exit that can come into play. Not ideal. None of those things are ideal. It means money is being left on the table for the family or the owner. It means they're operating in a crisis mentality. It means that they're not sufficiently planning and staging the things that need to be dealt with in a transition. So for those that do that, we call it a phased exit. Again, Ralph is a good example. Yard and a Half Landscaping is a good example. And a lot of the companies that I work with and a lot of the public education work that I do is really geared towards you must start at least 3 years in advance. Give yourself 4 or 5 if you want. That's helpful too. And we'll get into defining those transition stages distinct transitions that really need to be planned for a little later. And then the third is this restructuring for growth. This is not all about retiring baby boomers, okay? We all tend to focus on that as the language and the promotion around this and the education work we do. I work with a bunch of mid-stage entrepreneurs who started their business, they're in their 40s, all of a sudden they have 10, 15, 20 employees, little kids. They want some control back over their lives. They can't control what they've built and have a quality of life anymore. And in addition to that, in today's economy, in a lot of regions, the idea of attracting and retaining the best talent, an ownership stake is a golden ticket for that. So both for like personal and family sustainability reasons, and also around the idea of attracting and retaining the best talent by offering an ownership stake and structure is this restructuring for growth. And I'll give some examples of all of these. So the first example, in these examples I try to pick them because they're of different sizes, different sectors, just to give some real world examples of how this has happened. The Island Employee Cooperative, this is exactly what I was saying. This is a business owner, same guy owned these businesses, he and his wife, for 43 years. Didn't want to think about retiring until he wanted to think about retiring. And had no plan for the transition of the business. He knew his kids didn't want it. He knew that. So he knew his only option was to sell them. This is a very rural, very remote community. It is an island off a very long peninsula. It's bridged, but it's one of the oldest suspension bridges in the U.S. that sways and buckles when it's windy. So, and it's a half-mile long, so people flip out going over that.
What state is it?
Maine. Sorry, this is Maine. So about halfway up the coast of Maine. This is a very, very rural, very remote community. However, a large grocery store, a medium-sized grocery store, and a Ace Hardware variety craft store, really everything you could want, gift cards. So there's two islands, Stonington being the larger village, Little Deer Isle being the smaller village. So each of these stores are in one of the villages. Pretty good business model to be selling groceries on an island. However, that's what the owner's thinking. Who wouldn't want this? Well, it turns out nobody wanted it. Because he put these businesses on the market when his wife was like, his wife ran V&S, and he ran the two grocery stores. His wife was like, I'm done. I've said for, so they went through this personal debate. He's like, okay, we'll put it on the market. 2 years later, she's still running a store that she said she wanted to be done with several years ago. He's burned out. So one thing led to another. We were introduced, and they were so impatient at this point to be out of this business that we did this in about 12 months. Not recommended. This is big business. This is $13 million in sales over 3 enterprises with a penny margin, highly perishable business, right? Like you need training. It was also a very top-down managed business. There was not a leadership structure in place. He ran the place. Everybody did what he said. Everybody was his worker bee. It was so. Some challenges in that regard at an operational managerial level. However, we did pull it together. There's like 5 different lenders all participating in this. There was a lot of challenges to make this work. The buildings were not well maintained. It was a tired, physical plant. But we pulled it together and we made it happen. And everyone is a lender here. There's Cooperative Fund of New England and multiple other lenders, including their supplier, Associated Grocers of New England, which does come over into this way, which is also a purchasing co-op owned by independent grocers. I would say Associated Grocers of New England was a substantial lender to this deal because this is their 3rd largest book of business in their entire corporation. And they knew if this was bought by somebody else, it was going to go away. They were going to lose it because somebody else who would buy this would probably be like an independent Hannaford and would convert it. So it was really, they were really motivated to support the employee ownership buyout because they knew the employees would stay with them.
What percentage of funding did they bring to the project?
AG,
Yeah.
they covered all of the inventory, so it was about $650,000. That's a lot of money for a supply chain lender, right? So the employees own it. They just had their 5th anniversary of ownership. They've had some struggles, and it all related back to this transaction went too fast. It was all about the transaction and not about the training and the coaching of those taking over. So I just, plan ahead. If you're a business owner. But to this day, they're one of the largest employers on this island, or on these 2 islands. And so there's about 75 employees. And so here's an example, pretty big business, complicated, and lower skill, lower wage workforce, and a large employer. So let's talk about the sweet spot around phased exit. Rock City Roasters and Rock City Café, collectively loosely referred to as Rock City Coffee. This is in Rockland, Maine, which is a coastal community halfway up the coast. This company was started in the early 90s by the woman in the middle in the top picture, Suzanne, and her husband, Patrick. They opened the first used bookstore espresso bar in the state of Maine. And they did it in a community that at that time was derelict. There were few businesses on Main Street. It was not a nice downtown by a long shot. But they were a couple of hippies from California who moved to the coast of Maine and wanted to open a bookstore espresso bar because they liked books and espresso. And they found a loyal following. And they built this business, and it grew rapidly. They moved 3 or 4 times into bigger and bigger locations going up Main Street. They expanded and created a coffee roasting business, a separate wholesale and retail coffee roasting business because they wanted their own coffee to sell at the cafe. These are 2 distinct businesses, but obviously quite interrelated. And all at once, in 2010, in the span of less than a year, Patrick passed away from cancer. Their latest move came in the middle of the Great Recession, and they were over-leveraged given what was happening to lending and banks and so on and so forth. All of that happened to Suzanne in less than a year. And it was a serious challenge for her personally, as a business owner and personally. And so she started thinking in 2010, 2011, I need to figure out how I'm going to get out of these businesses because I can't handle all this right now. So she spun off the bookstore to 1 employee of hers, and then she maintained, and she really trained up her managing roaster to take care of the roastery, and she could focus on the cafe. And in that liquidation and that transition and delegation provided herself the space to start thinking about and studying what would it mean to sell the business to our employees. I want to point out this is a largely younger workforce. These are 20-somethings, 30-somethings. Many of these folks grew up in the Rockland region, worked for her as teenagers, went away to college and lived the life in Boston for a little while or something like that, and then came back because they wanted small town life. They loved Rockland. They wanted to be around their friends and family, and they loved their work at this company, and they loved Suzanne, and they came back and they went to work for her. So there's quite an interesting history amongst a good portion of these employees that fits that sort of profile. This was methodically planned out. I spent almost a year and a half just talking to her and her accountant before I ever even talked to the employees. So she had this completely figured out in her own head about how this could work before I ever even talked to the employees. She created a governance structure for her employees to start practicing what it means to be a board of directors and making strategic decisions about a business before they even owned it. And they were making consequential decisions. They weren't playing at it. We did an ownership transition where they actually did the corporate transaction And all through that and after that, she remained the general manager for another year, year and a half. And she just finally officially retired completely and is out of the business as of, I think, less than a month ago, or April. So she, her last day, within a week, she was in her Volkswagen Vanagon driving around the country. So, Railroad Avenue Supply Company, you've heard plenty about them, but I would say from my perspective, it was so well planned out, and Ralph did a tremendous job. I think it's a good role model for a business owner to know, to be self-aware of step in, step out kind of thing, and he'll work with the folks. That's Sarah, the general manager, corner, and she's doing a great job, and it's an impressive team. There's a real sense of teamwork there, but the other thing that added to the speed with which that could be done is that it wasn't explicitly stated, was that it was a stock sale, not an asset sale. So it was really just one corporation buying all the shares and with that comes all the assets, but all the advantages of the things that Ralph described. But the fundamental thing that made that possible was it was a stock sale as opposed to an asset sale. And so the Restructuring for Growth, this is a landscaping company down in the Hudson River Valley called Earth Designs Cooperative. This is the classic story. Asia, woman in the middle, started this landscaping company. She's a landscape designer, landscape architect, installation work. She started herself. In 15 years, she had 15 up to 15 to 20 employees. She was a single mom. She's working 80 hours a week. She's still got a structure where she's answering every client email, every client phone call. She's the foreman on every job. It's foolish at that point, right? Like, you can't operate with that kind of structure at that size. And the competitive nature of this industry, this is a skilled trade. These are very skilled folks, horticulturists, arborists, and so forth. So it was both. It was exactly what I described. It was like personal and family sustainability and attraction and retention of the best talent in a competitive skilled trades. And they're growing so fast, I can't even believe it. They're over 30 employees, I think, at this point. And this is another, it's the exact same story. I don't need to belabor it, but this is a solar or renewable energy installation, design, installation, consulting business, primarily solar, but also a lot of heat pumps and other water systems. And this is the second largest solar company, which isn't saying much because the largest is like over 150 some odd employees, and these guys are like 15 or 20. But nevertheless, it's the second largest company doing this work in Maine, and they have an outsized reputation for just like the skill and quality of what they do and the consistency. And so it's even more so here. This was about attraction and retention of the best talent. And this is in central Maine, Pittsfield, Maine. So there's some examples of different companies. So who's a good candidate? I like to say a company is a good candidate for transition to employee ownership, just as it would be a good candidate for anyone else to buy. Does it have stability, as in stability of market, stability of cash flow, stability of workforce? The cash flow, is there a leadership structure in place, or is there the capacity to build one? Or is there sufficient cash flow to replace it if the managing owner steps out? And then the sense of legacy, which for a lot of business owners and entrepreneurs matters, but not all of them. There are plenty of business owners who just want out as quickly and easily as possible. And maybe in those instances, liquidation is an option for them that makes sense for them. But generally, far more often than not, there is a sense of legacy. Entrepreneurs are a specific breed, and they do have that desire often to see what they've built be preserved and perpetuated. So just trying to be practical here, like there's no special magic about what makes a company good for employee ownership. What makes it good for employee ownership is what makes it good for anyone else who wants to buy it, any other buyer. The distinction here, of course, is that there's an inside buyer. right? There's a buyer that's right under the owner's nose that they could consider and develop and cultivate and do a very friendly, close to the vest inside transaction. Advantages and disadvantages. One of the greatest advantages is just flexibility. The cooperative corporate model is tremendously flexible. You can bend it in many, many different ways. It is largely characterized by largely defined by a handful of characteristics established in IRS law, not even in like legal code. In individual states, there is cooperative statute for incorporation, but largely that mimics what is long-standing IRS code characteristics of what you need to be and operate as in order to be a cooperative. Outside of adhering to that, there's just tremendous flexibility. The cost is low for transition, certainly compared to an ESOP. Frankly, compared to an outside sale, oftentimes the lawyering up in arm's length outside sales of a business can greatly surpass the cost of the perhaps specialized technical assistance that you need to do a sustainable, effective employee ownership transition. But the cost is much lower. And then the direct ownership. So if the employee base, if employee ownership makes sense for the employee base, and there's skill sets there or the capacity to build them, that direct ownership can make the subsequent governance transitions and management transitions a lot easier. Because the sense of direct ownership really builds something deeper in people than just passive stock ownership, which is what ESOPs are, for example. Disadvantages, unfamiliarity. People don't know what co-ops are, or they have like weird preconceived ideas of what co-ops are. They can only be very small. They can only operate in like food co-ops, or they're collectives where everybody's like debating like product placement on shelves and stuff. Like it shouldn't be communism. That's what it is. It really shouldn't be any of those things. But those are the perceptions that make it unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity breeds a sense of risk. Reduce risk, right? Like it's all about the risk. For lending, it's all about risk. For business development and transitions, it's all about risk. For the seller, to bother with doing this, it needs to be about reducing risk. Why would you go through sort of the planning that it requires if you think they're just going to blow it up? I mean, it's a waste of time. Just liquidate it and be done with it. And then the leadership needs. I keep stressing the leadership needs. And in stressing the leadership needs, I'll just say that we're talking about leadership at different levels: operational leadership, sort of governance, strategic planning type leadership, growing the firm type leadership, and then leadership as owners. These are different types of leadership, but they all come from sort of the same basic skill set. So a few other advantages. I think, and I was touching on this a second ago, this greater control of the process, this like very friendly, inside, close to the vest transaction can reduce risk in and of itself for lots of reasons. It can reduce risk of the market. When you put a business on the open market, your best employees start having an eye on the door, your vendors are wondering, your customers are wondering. You're introducing risk into your marketplace, which can materially hurt your business. If your vendors, customers, and employees don't know what the future of this business is, if it's up in the air, if you mitigate all that and say, we're going to do this, it reduces that risk. Owner knows the buyer's strengths and weaknesses, right? That's a big deal. And then the owner can remain in some varying levels of control until they're paid off. So that all of that is advantages, particularly from an owner's perspective. And then again, some other challenges. The financial resources, ability, and experience of that employee base can be more or less a challenge, and it's usually more. So that's where training and technical assistance and some education and mentoring come in. There's almost always going to be a longer departure timeline, and differing perceptions of value can cause problems of a business between employees and the owner. So There's some tax advantages to cooperatives. I think in the interest of time, we need to move along, so I won't spend too much time on this, but there's tax advantages to cooperative corporations. They have the special privileges of C Corps, but they're pass-through entities, kind of like an S Corp, so they operate in the sweet spot. Nowhere is near the tax advantages of an ESOP, except for the seller, who in certain instances can avail themselves of deferring all capital gains tax, but that's rare. So this is where I want to end, or these next two slides. The conversion process. I've alluded to this a bunch throughout this. The reason to define the reason, to put words to the reason an immediate exit is so troubling and problematic often, almost always, is that you are trying to do all three of these transitions at once. You're trying to transition the ownership of the company. That's like a legal financial thing, right? That's a transactional thing. At the same time that you're trying to help a group of employees figure out how to be entrepreneurs, how to think about strategic planning, how to think about the future direction, what is growth, what kind of growth do we want? These are big picture questions. At the same time that you're trying to do a management transition. Who's steering the ship? Doing all those three things at once is dangerous. And the reason the phase transition makes so much sense is because you are methodically segmenting and sequencing those three distinct transitions. And so this is something I just hammer on with both the sellers, with the employees, with the developing board. You have to think in terms of these three distinct transitions and be very clear when you're talking about something about the company that you are clear about which of these elements you're talking about. That's a bit of a conceptual idea. As a practical matter, I tend to put the clients I work with in kind of 5 buckets just for my own tracking purposes. So there's this explore phase. A business owner emails me or contacts me, or an employee contacts me and says, my boss said blah, blah, blah. So that's that initial set of conversations, which are very exploratory, educational. I'm answering basic questions, dispelling myths about what cooperatives are, what they aren't. What is ownership culture? You know what ownership culture is? There's a lot of stuff built up around it, but ownership culture is what gets companies put on best places to work list. That's ownership culture. So for all the mystery around what is ownership culture and how do we develop it, look at your local best places to work list and talk to those employees and see what they say. You know what they all say? They say they're happy, they feel respected, they feel like they have a voice at work, and they feel fairly compensated. That's ownership culture. That's what breeds it. So that's my little lecture about ownership culture, and don't make so much out of it. It's not that mysterious. And then it's sort of an assess phase where we're doing financial analysis, business analysis, and informal evaluation. We are a nonprofit. We do not want to engage with a business that we are not fully confident internally that we can go to the employees and represent. We think if you're interested, this could be a good deal. So that's why we do that business analysis, financial analysis, and informal evaluation to make sure we're representing accurately to the employees from our perspective that it's a good idea. And then some due diligence and feasibility. That's both of the owner, that's of the employee base. Sizing people up, right? Moving into that structure phase, we're actually engaging. They have a steering committee. You're engaging with them to develop corporate bylaws, articles of incorporation. You're doing some deeper education with a much smaller group around that. And you're starting to think about what would a purchase and sale agreement look like. Like what are the nuts and bolts things that the owner wants in terms of exit and timelines? What do the employees want? So that's the structure phase. Completion is as it is. And then support, the follow through, and so forth. We won't work with the company to do a transition unless they commit in advance, both the seller and the new owners, to work with us for some period of time post-transition, post-transaction. Because the last thing we want is for a company that we help to transition to employee ownership that then blows up because all of a sudden they don't know what they're doing afterwards and don't have anyone to ask questions of. So when an employee-owned company fails, employee ownership gets the blame. When any other company fails, like there's 50 million other things to blame, but it's always when an employee-owned company fails, if an employee-owned company fails, it gets blamed on employee ownership. So I have my own self-interest there, right, and making sure that any company that transitions to employee ownership has a good support structure and network. And that's it. So answer any questions about any of that. Yeah.
Do you find that in most of the transitions to co-op or employee-owned, the owner has to hold a portion of the note to facilitate transactions?
Yes, always.
What percentage typically should they maybe expect to be holding?
I think it's all over the map. I mean, Ralph finance 100%. I'm working with another company right now that's financing 100%. I've done a conversion where it was based on a royalty. It was a manufacturer, so he was clearly, so that's a bit of owner financing, right? It's I would say substantial, relatively substantial. Why would any outside lender put money into a transition if the current owner isn't willing to back it up with their own money and in second position? So it varies,
But
but
with traditional lending, you're pretty safe with a 20% estimate if you're
Yeah.
looking at, unless it's a lot of goodwill. But I was just curious to see,
Yeah.
what
yeah,
that-
it's always way more than 20%, because keep in mind, in the cooperative model, they are buying a share in the company, but that share is not tied to the value of the company. It's better understood as a membership fee. So, I mean, of the examples I gave you, the membership fees range from $2,000 to $10,000. None of those fees had any direct relationship to the value of the company. It represented what the employees, the board of directors, felt was a meaningful buy-in for that company. Like with Earth Designs Cooperative, it's $10,000. They're doing high-end work. They're skilled professionals. They don't want anyone thinking they can be an owner along with them in that company without substantial skin in the game. So it's that distinction of like, and it's going to be different in every company. With Rock City, it was like $2,500. With Rasco, it was $2,000. So. But it was different in every respect, and it was determined by them as sort of a gut feeling of what is the sense of skin in the game here.
We probably have time for one more question.
Okay.
The slide said finalize and then said PNS.
Yeah.
PNS is,
Purchase and sale, sorry, yeah, I should finalize PNS, finalize purchase and sale. You start with a draft, you start negotiating the fine points, right? Our purchase and sale agreements, we, in all respects, typically what we're trying to do is save money on lawyers and accountants. So if we can, through grant-funded services or reasonably priced fee for services, get you 90% of the way, 95% of the way there on sort of lawyers and accountants, we've saved quite a bit of money. It goes back to that cost issue. So we do a lot of the purchase and sale agreement. We do the draft, and then we help facilitate the negotiation, and then it goes to a lawyer for that last, that way, you've saved about 95% of the cost there. But,
I have what I hope is a quick question. I think the reason that a lot of people like me don't consider this is that if there's a conflict or something, somebody has to make the final decision,
Yeah.
right? And if it's an employee-owned company, I'm just picturing like 20 people sitting around a table and like having
Yeah.
a long feelings discussion about stuff.
Yeah.
So how is that built into kind of the structure of a cooperative? Like, if all the employees own a certain percentage and it's the same, if there's some contention, who makes that final decision? I guess it depends on the structure.
It depends on the structure, but it depends far more on what decision.
Oh,
So
okay.
you have bylaws and you have policies that very clearly delegate levels of decision-making to certain elements of the ownership.
Okay, that makes sense.
So never would 20 owners sit around and debate with feelings conversations much of anything,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, so this person's just making marketing decisions. Yeah, so just
Yeah.
put the decision in a bucket and let the
Yeah.
person in charge of that bucket.
I mean, let's remember at the end of the day, these are businesses that must compete in a market. They must offer a quality good or service that can compete in the private market. And if they can't do that, they're not going to last long. So the cooperative is, as I like to say, cooperatives own businesses, they don't run businesses. Managers run businesses. So to your question, it
Yeah.
really is why decision-making structures in cooperatively owned businesses are really critical to have clearly defined and documented. The members make these decisions. The board makes these decisions. Manager makes these decisions, and we don't cloud it.
Well, thank you so much for your
Yeah.
time and
Well,
joining us.
thanks.